passion governs, and she never governs wisely.
The colonies are not to be emancipated.
All men are created equal, victory or death.
In the darkness of war comes chaos. On the American frontier, west of the Appalachian Mountains, brutal fighting took place under the guise of the revolution, for motives very different than those high ideals of freedom and equality. And in Europe, France had been watching with a hungry eye for the right opportunity to confront a preoccupied and weakened Britain. The dogs of war had been unleashed, and no one knew how to harness them again.
The Americans weren't enemies. They were our kinsmen. They were the king's deluded subjects. Foolish, no doubt, wicked, possibly, but not foreigners, not enemies. They were really Englishmen. The American situation was not a war. But the worse the situation got in America, the greater was the risk that Britain's real hereditary enemies, France above all, but also Spain, would exploit the trouble, the difficulties that Britain had got into in the hope of getting revenge for their defeats in the previous war, in the 7 Years' War, when they had been so disastrously defeated.
When John Burgoyne surrendered his army at Saratoga, America at last looked like a credible force. 24-year-old Louis XVI and his ministers at Versailles decided that the time had come for France to formally enter the war. On February 6, 1778, Louis signed a treaty of alliance, militarily binding France to the American cause for the duration of America's War of Independence.
What happened in America had become a sideshow, because however troublesome, difficult, intractable the colonial problem was, it remained essentially a domestic problem and a colonial problem. The Americans did not pose a threat to Britain, not a direct threat. There was no more risk of the Americans invading Britain than there was of the Martians invading Britain. But the risk of France invading was real, serious, and immediate.
The road to this dramatic change in the nature and focus of the war was paved with intrigue. And one of the principal architects of the road was America's brilliant elder statesman, Benjamin Franklin. Since November of 1776, he had resided just outside Paris on the road to Versailles, watching and waiting for his opportunities as a congressionally appointed ambassador from a newly independent League of States.
Franklin was like a superstar in France. He was idolized. They had his picture everywhere. He said, "My phiz is as well known as the man on the moon." They had him on mantelpieces, on snuff box, on rings, in miniatures, everywhere. As John Adams bitterly related it in his diary, everybody idolized them, from the ministers down to the scullion in her kitchen, he said. They all thought he was going to bring back a golden age. America, of course, in itself was a dream for the French, the American dream, which in those days had nothing to do with buying cars or building a house in the suburbs. The American dream was one of liberty and justice.
'Tis a common observation here that our cause is the cause of all mankind, and that we are fighting for their liberty in defending our own. Benjamin Franklin, 1777.
Franklin understood his role and played it flawlessly. Since his public image was that of the frontier philosopher, he always wore simple clothes, a coonskin cap, and the bifocals of his own invention. As one of the world's most respected scientists, he entertained the intelligentsia of France. The great novelist Victor Hugo made this sketch of Franklin's residence in Passy. Queen Marie Antoinette dubbed him l'ambassadeur électrique. To young King Louis, the 70-year-old was deferential.
He studied the king, he got on his good side, and he remained forever on his good side and on the good side of the foreign minister. He did not antagonize them in any way.
Even so, his immense popularity as a folk hero was enough to irritate the king.
Louis XVI became so angered at this that he presented to a member of his court a chamber pot with Franklin's image on the inside as a kind of jibe at the whole Franklin mania that was going on at the time.
But long before the Treaty of Alliance, Franklin had been working behind the scenes, securing money and supplies for the American cause. One of his associates was a confidant of the king, Pierre-Augustin Caron Beaumarchais, the author of The Barber of Seville. As early as 1776, Beaumarchais was considering France's long-range goals.
The famous quarrel between America and England, which will soon divide the world, imposes on each power the necessity of examining closely to see how the coming of this separation will influence it for good or ill. Beaumarchais to Louis XVI, 1776.
Early in the war, with the secret blessings of the French government, Beaumarchais set up a shadowy trading firm known as Rodriguez, Hortelet and Company to ship arms and supplies to the Americans.
During the years 1776 and 1777, Rodriguez, Hortelet and Company provided about a dozen large shiploads of uniforms, rifles, gunpowder, and other military supplies, which were extremely valuable to the Continental Army.
The gunpowder, always in short supply and so crucial to the Americans, was the product of the greatest chemist in the world, Antoine Lavoisier. Benjamin Franklin, l'ambassadeur électrique, had helped his scientist friend fit the French government's explosives arsenal with his invention, lightning rods, to prevent catastrophic detonations. Through Rodriguez, Hortelet and Company, Lavoisier could return the favor.
Franklin's secret as a diplomat was his patience, his waiting for people to do things that he wanted them to do without exerting premature pressure on them. What he was waiting for, although he didn't fully realize it at the time, was for France to finish supplying its dockyards and rebuilding its navy so it would be able to fight a war with Britain. Once that was accomplished, France came to Franklin and his colleagues and negotiated the Treaty of Alliance.
Franklin and fellow ambassadors Silas Deane and Arthur Lee were quick to seize the opportunity they had cultivated for so long.
Franklin was at last able to swing an alliance, a military and political alliance with France. He probably was the greatest diplomat in our history because this was no easy task, winning that French alliance.
The alliance quickly bore fruit. In April of 1778, the Comte d'Estaing sailed towards America with a fleet of 17 ships, carrying 4,500 troops. Franklin stayed on in Passy until 1785, 2 years after he successfully negotiated another treaty, the one that ended the war.
Franklin's mission in France was as vague as any mission could be. He had been told by Congress he should procure whatever help he could, preferably money, of course, eventually ships. An alliance would be wonderful. Franklin succeeded beyond all hope in his mission. Everything that he had been asked to do was done. He got the money. He bled France white. I think if poor King Louis was eventually sent to the guillotine, it was because he had destabilized the French treasury to such a point by helping this country conquer its independence that, in a way, I think Franklin bears a little blame for the death of the unfortunate King Louis.
After a winter of illness and short rations, spring of 1778 brought the Continental Army at Muddy Valley Forge two great causes for hope: news of the alliance with France and the arrival of Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben, one of many European officers who had come to America seeking fame and fortune. The Prussian drill master arrived with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin and a desire to teach discipline to Washington's untrained army. Shortly after his arrival, he began drilling the troops through every daylight hour.
The genius of this nation is not in the least to be compared with that of the Prussians, Austrians, or French. You say to your soldier, do this, and he doeth it. But I am obliged to say, this is the reason why you ought to do that. And then he does it. Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben.
When some movement or maneuver was not performed to his mind, he began to swear in German, then in French, and then in both languages together. When he had exhausted his artillery of foreign oath, he would call to his aides, "Come and swear for me in English. These fellows won't do what I bid them." A good-natured smile then went through the ranks, and at last the maneuver, or the movement, was properly performed. Pierre Duponcel, von Steuben's translator.
The entry of France into the war caused the British to completely rethink their strategy.
The British switched from the attack to the defense in early 1778. They had to redeploy men to protect their fisheries in Nova Scotia and to foil the French anticipated attack on their sugar islands in the West Indies. The British were forced to consolidate their positions, and New York City was the strategically more important position, and so they abandoned Philadelphia and were retreating to New York City.
In June of 1778, Sir Henry Clinton, now in command of the British troops in America, set out overland for New York City with 13,000 men in a wagon train 12 miles long. The slowly moving target was irresistible for Washington and his von Steuben-trained forces. On the 28th of June, he attacked Clinton's rear guard near Monmouth, New Jersey, with part of his own army of 13,000. The resulting battle would become the largest land engagement of the Revolution.
I presume everyone has heard of the heat of that day. but none can realize it that did not feel it. Joseph Plum Martin.
It was 96 degrees at about 9 o'clock that morning. And by the middle of the day, the temperature had to be 110, possibly 120. A number of soldiers on both sides simply dropped dead from heat exhaustion.
Washington had initiated the battle with 5,000 of his troops under the command of Continental General Charles Lee, a former officer of the British Army who had been openly critical of him.
Washington is not fit to command a sergeant's guard. Charles Lee.
But early in the fighting, Lee had ordered his troops to retreat. Washington rode to the front and furiously confronted Lee for his puzzling command.
An officer named Scott from Virginia who overheard the incident said that as a connoisseur of profanity, he felt that Washington's damning of Lee at that moment was the most beautiful he had ever heard. He swore until the leaves shook on the trees, and like an angel from heaven.
Washington, of course, at this time didn't know it, but the whole British Army was there. It wasn't the rear guard. And they were coming after Lee like a piece of raw meat. They really were going to chew him into little pieces. So in a sense, Lee was doing the right thing. He did see that he was outnumbered, and he was trying to fall back to a better position.
Washington relieved Lee of his command and began to rally his troops.
Many of his supporters characterized Monmouth as Washington's finest hour. His generalship during the day was only adequate. Where his leadership was superb, though, was encouraging his men and making them feel very good about the American army. He rode back and forth in front of the lines and making appropriate gestures or words to his men, rode one horse to death, had to start a second, and was frequently exposed to enemy fire.
General Washington seemed to arrest fortune with one glance. His presence stopped the retreat. His graceful bearing on horseback, his calm and deportment, which still retained a trace of displeasure, were all calculated to inspire the highest degree of enthusiasm. I thought then, as now, that I had never beheld so superb a man. Marquis de Lafayette.
With Washington's encouragement, the Continentals held their positions. Both armies settled into an afternoon of furious artillery fire.
This field would have been wreathed in acrid smoke. The troops would have been choking on it. At the same time, they enjoyed a spectacular sound and light show. So for most of the afternoon, this was a no man's land, a smoke-filled no man's land between the two armies. We have been surprised to find out how many persons of color were in the Revolutionary Army, and there were many at the Battle of Monmouth, hundreds. In fact, as many as 7 or 8% of the Continental Army may have been composed of persons of color. Mostly African Americans, some free blacks, some slaves who had taken their masters' places.
African Americans were active participants on both sides in the Revolution. Their motivation was general patriotism, but also a personal belief that the war and its successful completion would bring them personal freedom, freedom for their people, and personal advancement.
During that sweltering afternoon, Mary, or Molly Ludwig Hayes, joined her husband in battle, helping to man one of the big guns. Because she spent most of the morning carrying pitchers of water to dehydrated soldiers, popular history knows her as Molly Pitcher.
It's quite clear that, like many other soldiers during that battle, Molly Pitcher was enjoying herself. When enough of the men collapsed around that gun, she was tough enough to step forward and play with the boys.
While in the act of reaching a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before the other as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs, without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case, it might have carried away something else, and continued her occupation. Joseph Plum Martin.
It was the closest thing to a formal battle that the American Army had fought in quite a while. And they did amazingly well. They slugged it out with the British, and they stood toe-to-toe and showed that they could hold their own in the field.
I singled out a man and took my aim directly between his shoulders. He was a good mark, being a broad-shouldered fellow. What became of him I know not. The fire and smoke hid him from my sight. One thing I know, that is, I took as deliberate aim at him as I ever did at any game in my life. But after all, I hope I did not kill him, although I intended to at that time. Joseph Plum Martin.
The exhausted armies quit the Battle of Monmouth at nightfall. The next morning, Clinton's army was gone. They were pushing hard for New York City.
Tell the Philadelphia ladies that the heavenly, sweet, pretty redcoats, the accomplished gentlemen of the Guards and Grenadiers, have humbled themselves on the plains of Monmouth. General Anthony Wayne.
For General Washington, this was a great public relations coup. He had sent his despised second-in-command forward to attack the British, and Lee had been forced to retreat. He had delivered an exhausted enemy to Washington's footsteps. Washington had then pushed the British back, so Washington gained the glory of the Battle of Monmouth. Lee was in disgrace, was forced out of the army, and it got rid of dissension in the American army and made it a much more cohesive unit.
Monmouth, considered a draw by most historians, was the last major engagement of the Revolutionary War to be fought in the North. Now the British would concentrate their efforts on the southern colonies and on fighting a contest for global supremacy with France.
The Americans were fighting in this war for two very clear goals. From the outset, they had in mind independence, and they had in mind expansion to the whole North American continent. They didn't have a vision of a future with just 13 colonies in a very narrow strip along the Atlantic seaboard. They had in mind Canada, the 13 colonies as we know them, Florida, and all of that part of America reaching out to the Mississippi.
Beyond the Appalachian Mountains lay a forest-cloaked land of almost unimaginable size and richness. Some of the most brutal fighting of the Revolutionary War took place there, over control of that land. The combatants weren't armies lined up in tight military formations, but guerrilla bands of Indians and settlers who struck with unbridled ferocity and then moved on.
I use the term savage not to attribute it to Native Americans, but to talk more about unrestricted warfare, warfare that involved children, it involved women, it involved non-combatants of all sorts. Many times, backcountry Americans who we want to hold to some sort of ideal were perpetuating brutal murders and brutal activity against Native people that we've traditionally attributed to Indians. But it was going both ways.
This portrait presents George Rogers Clark as a middle-aged and balding man. But in 1777, he was a 24-year-old, red-haired, raw-boned frontier colossus who had a plan that could secure for the newly independent League of States the area north of the Ohio River, including the choice Illinois country. Late in 1777, as Washington engaged Howe near Philadelphia, and Arnold and Gates met Burgoyne near Saratoga, Clark ventured to civilized Williamsburg, where his plan met with the approval of Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry.
Clark's plan, with the backing of Virginia money from Governor Patrick Henry, is to recruit a party of soldiers in the backcountry along the Ohio River, western Pennsylvania, down into Kentucky, float and march them overland and seize the British posts in the Illinois country, which is really the plum of the Trans-Appalachian West. It's where most of the population is at this point.
On the 4th of July, 1778, he took the first British fort, Kaskaskia, without firing a shot. The French townspeople were bewildered. Americans had been their enemies in the French and Indian War. Now that France had entered the War of Independence, Clark brought them the news that they were now allies.
Nothing could excel the confusion these people seemed to be in. Being taught to expect nothing but savage treatment from the Americans, given all for lost, they were willing to be slaves to save their families. George Rogers Clark.
Cahokia fell, followed by the town of Vincennes and its Fort Sackville. Then Clark set to the task of pacifying thousands of Indian chiefs and warriors.
Clark is a consummate Indian hater, but at the same time is very effective at negotiating with the native people that he comes in contact with in the Ohio country. He sort of adopts the role of the warrior rather than the diplomat, and he kind of blusters about how strong he is and about how his men are warriors, and talks to them as a fellow warrior as opposed to a peacemaker.
But while Clark negotiated with the Indians, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton swept down from his fort in Detroit with 500 Indians, British troops, and loyalists. Hamilton was known as the hair buyer because of the hundreds of scalps he had purchased from Indian war parties. Without firing a shot, he recaptured Vincennes and its Fort Sackville. His actions prompted Clark to undertake a legendary winter journey. He and his men would cross flooded prairies and lowlands to surprise Hamilton at Vincennes.
They could not suppose we should be so mad as to attempt to march 80 leagues through a drowned country in the depth of winter. They would be off their guard and probably would not think it worthwhile to keep out spies. George Rogers Clark.
When Clark is marching his men to Vincennes, he conducts these men, in a sense, like a war party. He gives war feasts so that different companies will go out and hunt deer and give feasts for one another. They have war dances. And when their spirits seem to be flagging, he paints his face black and leaps into the river with a war whoop to try and motivate his men.
Clark pushed his men hard through chest-deep icy water to reach Vincennes. Even as the grueling journey weakened Clark's men physically, it strengthened them spiritually. He noted that they began to feel superior to other men. On February 23rd, they arrived at their destination. Clark decided not to wait. He sent a letter to the French townspeople of Vincennes, telling them to stay indoors. He planned to take the fort that night. Wet, tired frontiersmen with rifles faced a fort armed with cannon.
One of the ways they're able to keep the garrison down and from really making a very effective defense is by firing through the loopholes and cannon ports of the fort, which keeps the British soldiers from manning the cannons and firing against them.
Smart firing all night on both sides. The cannon played smartly. Not one of our men wounded. Fine sport for the Sons of Liberty. Captain James Bowman.
By the next day, the British surrender was inevitable, and Clark's men captured a group of Hamilton's Indians. This is how the hair buyer himself reported Clark's next actions.
One of them was tomahawked immediately. The rest, sitting on the ground in a ring, bound, seeing by the fate of their comrade what they had to expect. The next on his left sung his death song, and was in turn tomahawked. The chief of this party, after having the hatchet struck in his head, took it out himself and delivered it to the inhuman monster who struck him first, who repeated his stroke a second and a third time, after which the miserable spectacle was dragged by the rope around his neck to the river, thrown in, and suffered to spend still a few moments of life in fruitless strugglings. Colonel Clark, yet reeking with the blood of these unhappy victims, came to the esplanade before the fort gate, where I had agreed to meet him and treat of the surrender of the garrison. He spoke with rapture of his late achievement, while he washed the blood from his hand stained in this inhuman sacrifice. Henry Hamilton.
With Hamilton's surrender, Clark ensured complete control of the Illinois country by the newly United States for the rest of the war.
It was the English that had been in support of the Indians' ability to maintain a homeland. They were the ones who were trying to prevent settlement. The English were the rational people to side with. The Americans, on the other hand, were the people invading their country, that were taking their game and taking their land.
At the time of the Revolution, the Eastern American Indian was hardly a mute primitive. He often spoke 4 or more languages, including French, English, and Iroquois.
Joseph Brant epitomizes the cross-cultural mixing that's going on in the American frontier at that time. While he is an Iroquois Indian, he is also a Freemason. While he is one of the principal leaders of the Iroquois League, he also has been to London and visited the king.
Joseph Brant and his loyalist colleague, Colonel Guy Johnson, together would launch some of the most vicious raids of the war, and likewise their allies would receive some of the most violent retribution. While Brant and Johnson raided in New York's beautiful Mohawk Valley, John Butler's loyalists and Indians raided valleys in western Pennsylvania. After the so-called Wyoming Valley Massacre, Butler claimed 227 scalps, while losing only 3 men of his own. In 1779 in New Jersey, General Washington learned of these raids and ordered the country of the Iroquois Confederacy to be invaded with total destruction of their settlements.
It became pretty obvious pretty quickly that the most efficient way of dealing with frontier situations was to have an overwhelming body of men march into the region and physically destroy the communities, the crops, and literally kill as many of the Indians they could get their hands on.
He embarked on a policy that would continue for years. Soon, the Mohawk word for President of the United States would translate as burner of villages.
Probably one of the most famous of these sort of anti-Indian campaigns was conducted by General Sullivan. He marched north along the Susquehanna River Valley in Pennsylvania into what is now New York and systematically destroyed all the Iroquois habitations in that part of the country.
Early in Sullivan's campaign, the American forces met the combined Indian and Loyalist forces of Joseph Brant, Guy Johnson, and Walter Butler. Nathan Davis remembered the encounter.
They commenced a fire behind every tree, and at the same time gave the war whoop. Not all the infernos of the Prince of Darkness, could they have been let loose from the bottomless pit, would have borne any comparison to these demons of the forest. Nathan Davis.
Sullivan's superior numbers and artillery soon routed the Indian and Loyalist fighters. Later in the day, one of Sullivan's riflemen found some of the Indians they had killed.
He skinned 2 of them from their hips down for bootlegs.
One pair for the major, the other for myself. Lieutenant William Barton.
The Indians were certainly capable of similar atrocities, although Sullivan's main force received little more opposition for the rest of the campaign. 2 of his riflemen that Indians managed to capture were brutally tortured.
We found they was both stripped naked and their heads cut off. And the flesh of Lieutenant Boyd's head was entirely taken off and his eyes punched out. Carice Beatty.
With drums and fifes announcing Sullivan's approach, Indians would abandon their villages before his army arrived.
They had this very distorted view that Indians were savages, they were dirty, they were lazy. This is particularly poignant when Sullivan's men arrive at the Iroquois villages. A number of them are amazed to find that, in fact, they're very well-organized communities. They live in log cabins. They find a number of very large apple orchards growing, very well-cultivated gardens, and in some cases, even domesticated animals.
By the end of his expedition, Sullivan had destroyed over 40 Indian villages and broken the political alliance known as the Iroquois Confederacy forever.
The American Revolution for the Native Americans does not effectively end. It bleeds into another war that becomes a war simply to maintain enough ground to live on. This war continues on until the very end of the 18th century, until America can effectively claim everything east of the Mississippi River.
Benjamin Franklin's loyalist son, New Jersey Governor William Franklin, was imprisoned in Connecticut on the 4th of July, 1776, the day the Declaration of Independence was signed. After 2 years, he was set free, but continued to be a devoted and aggressive loyalist leader. Franklin's daughter, Sally, however, shared the political views of her patriot father. Even as the British attended grand balls in her occupied Philadelphia, Sally organized women to sew shirts for the Continental Army.
They sold more than 2,000 shirts, very good shirts, and Washington knew about this and congratulated her, and it was referred to Franklin, who felt very proud in Paris. So Sally's shirts got some reputation.
Washington accepted the shirts for his army in January of 1780, the middle of the most punishing winter his army would ever have to endure. Since the Great Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778, Washington's most demanding challenge had been to simply hold his army together. He was disappointed that the French seemed more interested in fighting for the wealth of the West Indies than fighting for the freedom of the newly United States. But the French presence had diverted Clinton, whose forces were concentrated in New York. At the end of 1779, Washington moved his army back to the hills above Morristown, New Jersey. He set his men to the task of building a soldier city of log cabins. They lived in tents until the cabin's completion.
The sufferings of the poor soldiers can scarcely be described. While on duty, they are unavoidably exposed to all the inclemency of storms and severe cold. At night, they now have a bed of straw on the ground and a single blanket to each man. They are badly clad, and some are destitute of shoes. Dr. James Thatcher.
In less than 2 months, they had constructed over 1,000 cabins. Now at least they had some relief from the unrelenting snows. But the snows made transport of food and other supplies extremely difficult.
We were absolutely, literally starved. I do solemnly declare that I did not put a single morsel of victuals into my mouth for 4 days and as many nights, except a little black birch bark which I gnawed off a stick of wood, if that can be called victuals. I saw several men roast their old shoes and eat them. and I was afterwards informed by one of the officer's waiters that some of the officers killed and ate a favorite little dog that belonged to one of them. Joseph Plum Martin.
Although Washington sympathized with the misery of his troops and lobbied constantly to alleviate it, he didn't share it.
Washington headquartered in the mansion of a widow named Ford, a beautiful house, but terribly crowded when his whole staff and his servants had to house with him.
Martha came from Mount Vernon to join her husband, as she did every winter of the war.
At Morristown, though he had daily concerns with his army, the social side of Washington emerges. We see him having afternoon riding parties with the ladies and evening dinners and balls and dances.
This has been true of armies since the dawn of time. Of course, the general lives better than the enlisted men. So at Morristown and Valley Forge and other winter camps, Washington lived in a fairly substantial house, very often almost a mansion. The enlisted men accepted as part of the class system of the day, as long as he made sure that their food was decent, they had enough firewood, and he did work day and night at that. He was always struggling with the commissary to get better food for these men and writing to the Continental Congress to try to do something about the abominable system of feeding the army, which they had set up.
Nevertheless, Washington faced the first Continental Army mutiny at the end of that snowy Morristown winter. On the evening of May 25th, several armed regiments paraded about the camp with their arms, refusing to disperse. They were angry about their lack of food and poor conditions, yet unsure about their methods. The mutiny soon lost its explosive quality, but the frustration of the troops remained.
The worm of hunger gnawing so keen kept us from being entirely quiet. We therefore still kept upon the parade in groups, venting our spleen at our country and government, then at our officers, then at ourselves for our imbecility in staying there, and starving for an ungrateful people who did not care what became of us. Joseph Plum Martin.
The mutiny ended quietly and without violence. But Washington was deeply affected by the dissatisfaction of his men and harbored pessimistic thoughts about winning the war without greater support from an indifferent citizenry and an ineffectual Congress.
Certain I am that unless Congress speaks in a more decisive tone, unless they are vested with powers by the several states competent to the great purposes of war, or assume them as a matter of right, and they and the states respectively act with more energy than they hitherto have done, that our cause is lost. George Washington after the Morristown Mutiny.
The war had grown long. By the end of the Morristown winter, nearly 5,000 Americans had lost their lives in the 5 years of struggle to combat injuries. But several times as many had died of starvation and disease. And still, no end to the fighting was in sight.